We're here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's October 17th here in Seoul, and I am Shin Yeun, and you're watching News Generation, where we discuss the latest issues concerning our generation. Joining me in the studio is Jessica Arirang.
Happy Tuesday, everyone.
Happy Tuesday, and Park Ki-hoon.
Thank you for having me.
Now, both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s and share their own insights. As usual, let's start with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. Starting next year, eye drops might no longer be covered by Korea's health insurance. Until now, people were able to buy eye drops at 10% of the original price, but from next year, people who haven't been diagnosed with a specific eye disorder will have to pay full price. That includes those who wear contacts regularly or have had LASIK surgery. A final decision will be made this December. And over the weekend, a South Korean military aircraft safely brought back citizens and foreign nationals from Israel. The transport plane on Saturday departed from an airport in Tel Aviv, carrying 163 South Koreans, 6 Singaporeans, and 51 Japanese nationals free of charge. Japan's top diplomat in public has since thanked Seoul's foreign ministry. At the same time, the Japanese public has questioned why their own government has just now sent their own transport plane, which carried only 8 nationals back home, but each had to pay around 30,000 yen, which is around $200, to ride the plane. And it's almost 1 year since the Itaewon Crush tragedy last Halloween. A total of 159 people who went out to the narrow alleyways of Seoul's Itaewon neighborhood died. Most were in their 20s. And recently, officials found out that more than 1,300 firefighters were going through counseling or therapy sessions after being traumatized. Now, most were traumatized by the fact that they felt they didn't do enough or didn't arrive at the scene early enough to save more lives. Since the tragedy last year, many have been suffering with anxiety and going through sleepless nights. And the fire department has been providing trauma treatment for firefighters. By the year 2025, they're also thinking of opening a hospital dedicated just for firefighters. And trauma, it's definitely something one cannot overcome overnight. So what did you think about this news story in particular, Ki-hoon?
It's so sad and unfortunate that Korea had to go through this kind of tragic event in this day and age. I think the media didn't focus too much on the firefighters, even though they tried so hard to save every single life. And they were actually rather blamed for their lack of promptness, and they were questioning their capabilities of being, firefighters. As much as it's hard for the bereaved families, I think firefighters who were actually at the scene would have equally gone through a tough time.
Absolutely.
And we never really thought about the suffering they had to go through ever since that tragic event up until today. So I think we all know they did everything they could, so we should support them, help them to overcome their traumas so that they will continue to serve our country and hopefully to prevent any of these awful accidents from ever happening again.
Exactly. What was really disheartening for me as well when I read relevant comments on this news story was that some people were saying, if you're a firefighter, you should be mentally strong enough to go through that. But that's not true. Trauma doesn't have to do with whether you're strong or not. Once you have an incident, it just enclaves in your head for years and years, which requires a lot of counseling.
Absolutely.
What was your thought on this story?
I absolutely agree with you again, and I'm so glad that there will be a hospital dedicated, hopefully, to trauma patients, because let's face it, PTSD is a very serious and dire issue for many, many workers on the front line of these emergency happenings. We're talking about not just firefighters, but even surgeons. They go through a lot when they lose a patient. Or like war veterans, people who are really putting their lives to save our lives should be the first and foremost, patients to be treated so that they can really become a protection and actually do the job that they are supposed to do. So I really hope that the government dedicates more resources, not just for this Itaewon crisis, but for everyone who is putting their lives out there to make sure that we sleep very safely at night.
I totally agree. South Korea does have its own trauma treatment center, given that post-traumatic stress disorder is such an ongoing and pressing issue. But as you mentioned, if they specify it for different occupations,
absolutely.
and not just limited to a specific incident, that would be great. And that was our news feed for this Tuesday. Let's switch gears to our main discussion topic of the day now. You may have heard about the concept of well-being, but what about well-dying? To find out what it is, take a look at the screen. The longer our life expectancy has become, the more attention we've turned to the concept of well-dying. Just as its name suggests, well-dying is similar to well-being. Instead of promoting ways to better live life, WellDying navigates ways for people to better prepare for death. Surprisingly, this concept is more popular among millennials and Gen Z rather than seniors. Experts believe this mainly has to do with social media. Social media places tragedy at our fingertips, which in turn makes discussions related to death ubiquitous. So yesterday on News Gen, we talked about 고독사, which in Korean means dying alone, and we've decided to expand on that concept and dig a bit deeper into how our generation views death. More specifically, good death. Now, this seems to be another top issue among our generation. So, Cheska, could you first tell us the concept of WellDying and how it surfaced among our generation?
Absolutely. And before I start, I have a fun little question.
Okay.
Okay, if I tell you death, what is the first thought that comes into your mind, or facial expressions in Ki-hoon's case? Because he looks like he's about to cry. I miss my mommy.
So I'm guessing not a positive emotion for you.
Not really.
But same here, I'm afraid of it.
I think, death has, long been associated with obviously negative connotation. It's frightening, it's very unknown. But before we get worrisome, WellDying is actually more about a mentality and actions that young people are taking nowadays to accept, appreciate, and even embrace this eventuality of death, hopefully far down the future. And as Ki-hoon and I will elaborate a little bit later, this is almost a very proactive approach to sort of understand and embrace the eventual mortality of our lives. And, people actually trying to die well, so that it translates into having a beautiful and more positive impact during the lives that they have.
Right. And this concept of WellDying has actually opened up a new market, I hear, Ki-hoon. So I hear some places are allowing people to trial run their own death and even funerals. Could you elaborate a bit more?
Definitely. As much as the term WellDying, it sounds very interesting, many youngsters actually pay money to experience their own death and funeral. And just like what Cheska mentioned, it actually has a positive impact on their lives. A few years back, many millennials gave up on many things like being in a relationship, getting married, and buying their own house because of the economic downturn. So instead, they turned to taking portrait photos because of their own funeral down the track, because they didn't have too much to look forward to. But ironically, the whole process really helped them to look back on their own lives and really appreciate what really mattered the most and what they should do about living a better life moving forward until death.
Right.
So a lot of photo studios were in business because of this kind of trend back then. And secondly, the excessive use of social media, where anyone can see disturbing videos of people getting killed in wars, even people getting stabbed in the street during daylight. I think many youngsters realize that death could happen to them anywhere at any time. So they wanted to kind of be ready for any kind of prepare for any kind of tragic event. So after doing the trial run of their own funeral, they would actually end up selling unnecessary items to live a minimal life, and even apply to be an organ donor. And write their last will at a very young age. And all these little steps has helped them to live a better life and prepare for a better death, because that's quite a new term for us. But they're doing that now, and obviously we can say that many, I think, socio-economic factors have really changed the behaviors of a lot of millennials and Gen Zs these days.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess the key concept of WellDying is better preparing yourself for the deathbed. And Cheska, I hear you've actually tried this out yourself, right?
Yes, I am one of those that Ki-hoon mentioned that actually paid the money to do a trial run for what it's like to have a sort of death experience. And I can tell you and everyone that's watching that for me personally, it was one of the most splendid and amazing experience that I've had. First, I went through the stages of taking the portrait, writing my own will, which I brought with me, and also wearing a shroud, which is a garment that you wear before you go into the coffin. Now, one of the interesting things that our instructor told us about the shroud is the shroud does not have any pockets, meaning when you die, you do not take anything with you. And when we were writing our will and thinking about the lives that we had, I came to realize that I was very much at peace rather than being fearful and frightened as I thought I would be when I wasn't as close to the concept of death as I was. And when I got out of the experience, I had this, very silent moment to just think about what kind of life I have lived so far and what kind of life I want to live, because there's an eventual death that is coming. And for me, it was an incredibly positive experience. And I actually tried it, not because I was having, a life crisis or depression, but I really did it because I wanted to take the opportunity to make sure that I was on the right path in this life. Like, am I rerouting my values correctly? Am I treating the people that I love with, care and integrity? And I think this experience was something that just opened my eyes to a whole lot of things.
And what I'm curious about is, when you were there, on the screen we saw a lot of people in their 50s and 60s try it out. But I hear that a lot of millennials and Gen Z youth are also doing it. Did you see a lot of people in their 20s and 30s join you?
It's very interesting that you said it, because when I was doing it, there were two groups that came together. And one was the church group with the 40s and a little elderly people. And there was a youth group that came. They were in their sort of, I guess, late teens.
I see.
Yeah, and they were just as invested and serious about the experience as anybody else was. Yeah.
As Kyun elaborated before, not only is social media allowing us to see death on our fingertips, I also think our generation is much more keen and attentive towards the concept of death. So could you also elaborate on why you think our generation is so fixated on this concept of well-dying then?
It's a very interesting question. I think, we have gone through a lot in terms of COVID. And, COVID was something that hit us when we were completely unprepared. But I would like to also add on top of that, and I say this with, a lot of gratitude and almost caution, I think we live in a society and era where we're very privileged to think about having our life to a level that is just beyond living. I think we're sufficient enough that our focus in life is to elevate the quality of our lives, not thinking about the day-to-day, sustainable routines. So the fact that we can think about the quality of death, I believe, is a sign that our generation, wants to elevate their quality to the next level.
And that's definitely, I feel like, a luxury these days, given the geopolitical situation. We're seeing a lot of youth out in Israel and with the Israel-Hamas war, a lot of just sacrificed innocent lives out there. And I think that's why our generation is so fixated on the concept of well-dying, because right now, that's the luxury we can enjoy. For countries that aren't at war. Now, Kyun, would you like to elaborate on why you think our generation is so keen on well-dying? And also, could you add on what you think it means to have a good death?
I think we've all come to realize the inevitability of death. So instead of avoiding it, hoping that it wouldn't happen to us, I think just accepting it in a mature manner, and at the same time reminding ourselves again how important life is, because at the end of the day, you only have one life to live, and you don't have a second chance when it comes to death. And with me, like, the concept of having a good death is, for me, it's like, I think, other than living a very fruitful life, happy life to the fullest, signing an advanced medical directive, AMD, in advance to reduce the pain and suffering of death, not only to myself, but to the family that's going to be around me during that process. So I think that could be one example of well-dying. And also, I mentioned this before, signing up to be an organ donor as well. That can be a bit more meaningful in the midst of all the grief and loss.
What about you, Cheska? How would you define a good death?
That is such a multi-leveled question. I recently attended a photo exhibit by an LA photographer called Andrew George. And what he did was he took photos of terminally ill patients and how they would prepare death. And in the exhibition, there was a foreword by a very famous writer, Alan de Botton, and he said this quote, "Death refashions our passion." Like, it reorients something in us that we have never thought about before, because it makes us realize that there are things that are important to us, we thought were important, that does not become important when we're faced with death. And, it leads us to attach new value to things that we hardly would have ever thought of. And for me, I think that's something that possibly good death good, quote unquote, good death would be that it almost makes us confront things
Right.
that we otherwise wouldn't. It almost makes us become like superheroes because there is an end. So we can try things. We don't want to have any regrets.
Right.
So I think in a way it empowers us almost. Yeah.
That's a very compelling argument there. And we asked a very similar question to our viewers on what they think is good death. So take a look at the screen to find out what 3 of them had to say. Let's start with Obiki. I think that passing in a way where you have no regrets, have lived your life to the fullest you possibly can, and feel like you've secured everything for your future generation is the best way to pass. Terrace Bell said, I'm not afraid of death, but my ideal way of dying is silently drifting away in my sleep after living a fulfilling life, whether it be long or short. Shegareth said, dying well means I get to choose when and how I go. Good morphine dosage, nice scotch, some cigarettes, and surrounded by loved ones will be enough. I'd hate to lie in bed half comatose waiting for death to come. That just seems like an undesirable way to go. So passive. Now that's what our viewers had to say, but now let's hear what a psychology expert thinks about millennials and Gen Z's growing interest for this concept of well-dying. To find out why our generation is more prone to the concept of well-dying and proactively seeking ways to better prepare ourselves for the deathbed, we're going to include a psychology expert in our talks. It's Arirang, who is an intern counselor from You and Me Psychological and Counseling Services here in Seoul. Welcome, Arirang.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Hello.
Our pleasure. Now, Arirang, could you give us your own diagnosis to why our generation seems to be so interested in the concept of well-dying?
I think it's helpful to take a look at the characteristics of our generation to understand why we're so interested in well-dying. I think one of the characteristics of our generation, the MZers, is that we seek meaning in everything. We tend to break the norms and find the true purpose and meaning of life to seek happiness. When you start seeking the answers to what is the meaning of life, I think it eventually reaches the thought of what kind of life do I want to live? And there is no greater motivation for life than facing the fact that there is death at the end. It is a way to find the purpose of meaning and redefine one's values. I think the passion for finding the purpose of life and the happiness is what drives the young generation to have an interest in well-dying.
You know, it's no question that death is such a scary and foreign concept to all of us that are living. Would you, in your opinion, preparing for death sort of healthier than avoiding the issue or being afraid of thinking about it? And more specifically, I actually did the death trial. Do you think taking these pictures for a funeral in advance and trying out these deathbed experience is good for our mental health or something that you would recommend?
Yeah, definitely. Because death is a natural life process. No one can avoid it. So rather than being avoidant or afraid of it, accepting death gives an individual more strength in life because you're fully accepting life. But I think it is also important to be aware of the fear of the unknown. The death, that is very also natural. So by experiencing well-dying activities like designing your own funeral, taking pictures in advance, I think these things can help an individual to face the unknown and think about what they're really afraid of. It's a good opportunity to address the fear of the unknown.
Okay, my question is, what would be the best way mentally to practice well-dying?
Ironically, when we think about well-dying, it is directly linked to well-being in the present moment. So taking care of oneself here and now is the best way to practice well-dying. Knowing your own life values and goals, and how would you like to design your own life, and knowing how you can do that is part of well-dying. So I want to introduce three questions that is often asked in the hospice care. The first one is, how would you like to die? A very direct question, but it kind of gives you an idea of how do I really want to die? The second one is, do you have any regrets? Third one is, anything unsaid to the loved ones? So these questions can help individuals to think about death and life at the same time, reframe their life values and focus on the life that you're living right now. I think we need to talk about death more in a healthy way. So fully accepting life by accepting death is the best way to practice well-dying.
And John, I can't agree with you anymore because death, though it seems to be a very distant concept, especially for our generation, given that we are quite young, I think it's something that we need to be accepting and talking about so we know how to better facilitate healthier discussions. Thank you so much, Injung.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, and let's wrap up today's episode by practicing what Injung told us to do to practice well-dying. And that's by thinking of, do we have any unsaid comments to our loved ones? So, Ki-hoon, what would your last word of advice or
That is so
snippets of wisdom be, given that you're on your deathbed?
Ki-hoon, you've got the tears ready?
I mean, it's a tough question because it's not
Beautiful
going to happen to us, happen to me right now, but you never know what's going to happen with life. But there are many famous quotes and things that I would like to say when I'm in that moment, but I like to keep things simple in life and just say, live with no regrets. That's what I like to say, yeah.
All right, what about you, Cheska?
You know, when you asked me that question, I had this like pang in my heart. I think, you know, I use this analogy of marathon. We run the marathon to set our best records, right? We don't run just to run. And I kind of think about that too, although it might sound really pessimistic to some people. I think we live eventually to die at our best record. So I think my last word though would be to say, all my loved ones, forget me now, for I have lived. Yeah.
Forget me now, for I have lived.
Yeah.
And over the past 2 days, we've been talking about death and how our generation perceives it. And hopefully it isn't to bring out those pessimistic vibes.
This is very optimistic.
Yeah, actually,
was.
it is for us to better shed light on the fact that we are well aware of death and we're willing to accept it.
Absolutely.
And we're hoping to facilitate healthier discussions on how we can better accept it. But in the meantime, we'll be here every day from 9:30 to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Cheska Dainong.
Pleasure's always mine. Thank you.
Park Ki-hoon.
Always a pleasure.
All right, and thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are
News Generation.